One thing about the predecessor and so forth. I mean, you were president of the United States. You were the leader of the country. You were elected twice by the people of this country on substantive issues. Now we find ourselves in a really a challenging economic time, and it is being said that you drove the economy in the ditch. You were behind the wheel in the car. And Mr. President, the people, we can't relate to being president. We can only try to understand it. And what we do when if we hear ourselves being blamed for things that we had nothing to do with, our tendency would be to respond to it, to try to correct the record. But in your book, you steer clear.
Well, on this issue, I don't steer clear because I remind the reader that on the issue of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, I saw a problem and went to Congress and said, look, this is a group of this is an enterprises that have got an implicit government guarantee, and they're taking risky stances, and therefore we ought to regulate them. If they've got a government implicit guarantee, there ought to be some sense of regulation to make sure they don't misuse that guarantee. And I make it clear in the book what happened, and that is that powerful forces in Congress resisted that reform. If those reforms had taken place in 2003, it's hard to predict whether or not this crisis would have occurred, but I'm comfortable in telling the reader, and comfortable that history will judge, that we try to do something about it. And, and eventually the truth wins out. And this book's an attempt to, set the record straight from my perspective.
Is that your faith speaking, that the truth will out?
Do I think that? Yeah, I do. Look, I remember when Ronald Reagan left office. Frankly, you're old enough to remember when Ronald Reagan left office.
Yeah, I am.
And, dunce, warmonger, all the names he was being called. And at the time of his burial, he was being viewed as a superb president, and rightly so.
If you had it to do over, you were talking about Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. If you had it to do over, would you do the TARP bailout?
I would have. Because
what were you told about that? What did they tell you that made it?
We were headed for a second depression. Or, they didn't say quite that, it was a little more nuanced than that, but if you don't do something big, we could see a second depression, or depression bigger than the second depression. And, if you're the president, you don't have time to gamble. And I didn't like using taxpayers' money to bail out the people that got us in trouble. I didn't like it at all. But but when you're president, you get faced with stark choices, and I couldn't have lived with myself had the country gone into a deep depression, and people's lives would have been affected, and people thrown out of work. And there's a lot of people not in work today, and all of us, are concerned about that. But the situation could have been a lot worse.
Well, you talk about the people that got us into trouble. Some people think it wasn't Wall Street by themselves. Some people think it was the Democrat Party. You talk about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the whole subprime mortgage mess. I mean, that was a brainchild of Democrats.
Yeah, that's right.
But this is we bailed the Democrats out of a problem too, and they continue to this day to blame you and the Republicans for it. Although I don't think they're getting away with it any longer. The election returns, I think, signal that. We're talking with former President Bush.